Hello and welcome to another episode of your Retirement Planning Simplified. I'm Joe Curry, along with my co-host, as always, Lindsay Wilson. How's it going, Lindsay?
Great, Joe. I'm glad that we're covering this topic today about cybersecurity, and it kind of dovetails nicely. We're having a client event on Friday, which will be about the safe disposal of paper and paper documents. And we did an e-waste event last year too.
Yeah, so obviously, when we're dealing with money, um, security, confidentiality, these are all really important things, right? And obviously, there's everything that we can do in here as far as protecting our clients' data and making sure we're following safe practices. But it's also important that our clients, our listeners, are understanding where they're at risk and some things that they can think about to lower the risk of any kind of cybersecurity attack. So, Scott is an expert in this area, and we had a pretty good conversation. I think we touched on a few different important things, like who are these people who are doing cyber attacks? How do they typically show up? What kind of actions can we be taking to limit our risk and things just to be aware of? So it was a good conversation.
Yeah, and he's a certified information systems auditor and holds a master's in business administration. He's also CEO and founder of Click Armor, which is a gamified cybersecurity learning and simulation platform used for training business teams to avoid phishing, social engineering, and deep fake accounts. He also has his own podcast, the Shared Security Podcast, and is a moderator for the Cybersecurity Awareness Forum. So we have an expert on cybersecurity today.
Yeah, so I think this isn't specifically retirement related, but we know a lot of retirees are the focus of scams and cyber attacks. So I think there's some really good information today, and I hope you learned something. All right, Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Joseph. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so I'm grateful that you reached out to me, Scott, about this episode because this is actually a topic we've talked about having on the show, but we haven't yet, and that's just around cybersecurity, right? Which is obviously a big thing nowadays, and I think even more so when we're talking about people's money, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the news media has made things pretty scary these days, talking about AI taking over the world and attackers using deep fakes to impersonate audio and video, and it's pretty scary for a lot of people, and especially when you got your whole life savings wrapped up online somewhere, right? I mean, we live in a world of what we call rapid information sharing, where you're always feeling compelled to check the next email or respond to somebody, and it's not that hard to protect things if you actually take the time to slow down, and that's kind of what I teach people.
perfect. So I'm excited to talk about that. But before we do, I just saw a note about you losing over 100 cell phones, I think is what I read. So I thought maybe we could open up with that.
Yeah, for sure. So just it takes me back. I've been in cybersecurity for, well, before it was called cybersecurity. So I was an engineer by training from Waterloo, and as I was doing software and security engineering work, I decided I wanted to start teaching people about the risks online, because we have great security technologies, but I knew the attackers were going to start focusing on the people. And so I needed a way to kind of connect with people. And I wanted to go out and teach, and I'd do lunch and learns for anybody who would listen at the time. And I needed some kind of data to say, here's something interesting to talk about as an icebreaker. And I read an article about, on the technical side, it was called penetration testing, where the hackers try to, or ethical hackers try to break into a customer's banking site or something, to prove, to see if it's secure. And they had used USB drives as a way of using malware and proving to his client that he had broken into the bank or whatever. And I thought that's a brilliant kind of experiment, and it definitely illustrates how vulnerable an organization can be. But I didn't really want to get into the actual malware of things, so I started dropping USB drives with very simple stuff on them to see what people would do with them. And it was just HTML files with weird names, and people would click on them, and I could see which device somebody opened and what files they opened. That was all I could see. And then Symantec, a big security software company, had seen me blogging about this, and the fact that 60% of the devices that I dropped basically people would plug in and open up something on them, and it was kind of
Really?
a good, yeah, it was a really good icebreaker to say, you know what, people shouldn't be doing this because it puts your systems at risk, and a whole lot of stuff you don't realize is happening. And Symantec said, we'd like to do this because we've got new software for smartphones. This was in 2010, and they wanted to do it on an iPhone, and we said, could we lose some phones and see what people do with them? So I said, well, maybe we could do that. And we ended up not doing them with iPhones, but with Android phones, because it was much easier to work with. And we put fake apps that said, there's no internet connection right now, try again later. And we also had GPS tracking on these phones. And so we lost, in one project, we lost 50 phones in New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles, and here in Ottawa. And so we tracked to see what happened with it. And turns out, 50% of the time, people would offer to return the phone. But over 80% of the time, people would break into the phone, or not break in, but there was no password on it. So we just see opportunistically what people would do. And they turned out they would go in and look at things like private pictures, banking information, emails. And so it was a really interesting psychological experiment. But over a few years, I worked with Symantec, and yeah, we lost over 100 phones.
Very interesting. Not too many people can say they've lost over 100 phones. So,
Yeah.
All right. So, talking about cybersecurity, maybe the first thing we could just dive into, who are the cyber criminals that we need to worry about, and how do they actually steal our money?
Yeah, for sure. And interestingly, there aren't a lot of different kinds. There's, they fall into a few different buckets. Some of them are really organized crime. And when you think about it, a decade or two ago, when you thought of organized crime, you'd think of the dark sides of a city that you don't want to go in because you're going to get mugged, right? And now you're much more likely to be a victim of an online crime than in the physical world. So the cyber criminals have gotten very good at convincing people to give their money or give their passwords or give access in some way. And so they're very well organized. In fact, some of them have almost multi-level marketing systems, right? Where they have different players, that they will pay part of the proceeds, or they will rent out their ransomware kit to people for money. And it's all a big ecosystem. So the organized crime is by far the biggest player, and they're really looking for money, right? So it's ransomware, extortion, all kinds of stuff like that. The next would be nation states. So you've heard of, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Most of the time they are looking for economic benefits for their country and their country's companies. And so they're usually stealing from large enterprises, intellectual property, or things like that. But they will always take money when they can get it, right? So they'll hire people to steal money, and if they see high net worth people, they could go after them. The third type is what we call lone wolf attackers, and those are just people who are highly skilled at hacking, and they'll just go out and scam people and make their own money. There was a guy in Ontario, Mikhail Vasiliev, I think his name was, who was arrested just a year or two ago for having launched a bunch of ransomware on different people around North America. So those are the three main ones. There's also insider attacks, trusted people
Sure.
that, may have a beef with, the organization, their boss or whatever, or they're just, maybe sometimes they have an addiction or some other thing that you don't really understand, but it's compelling them to abuse their access and things like that. Those are the main kinds of attackers that we see.
Okay. So probably no surprises there. But how are they actually getting into our systems, or how are they actually getting our money?
Yeah, so I mean, by far the largest sort of financial issue right now is ransomware, and so it's essentially taking over somebody's computer, locking it up with encrypting the entire system so that nobody can do anything on it, and they can spread across a whole organization, and then they ask for money to unlock it. And it's been a very profitable thing for the last 10 years, really, but still leads sort of in terms of how much money is being lost. And so ransomware is typically triggered by an email. So somebody would receive an email that looks like it's from somebody they recognize, or it's a very compelling story. We call it a pretext in social engineering terms. They made up a story that's plausible, and they're playing on your emotions to get you to act quickly, and you're not really thinking about the security implications or the procedures you should be following. And all of a sudden you click on a link or an attachment and it infects your computer. And basically that's how that gets triggered. But there are other kinds of scams that the criminals will use as well, which don't necessarily involve malware or infecting your computer. Those are social engineering scams or cons. And there's a bunch of different names for some of these things. There's pig butchering and romance scams you've probably heard of, right? Where people will take advantage of especially elderly who are looking for, a companion, and they'll go a long way to convincing somebody in a long distance relationship, usually, that they're a good friend and trustworthy.
Yeah.
And then they start getting them into things like crypto. They'll say, "Oh, I've been investing in crypto and it's making me a lot of money," and they don't really push it. They sort of wait until the person says, "Well, tell me more about that." And the more interested they get, then they say, "Well, I could get you in if you want," and so then they start investing money. And there have been people who've lost millions of dollars just putting in those things. And at first it looks real. They'll even give you some money back if you ask for, a withdrawal, but that just all is to convince you to put more in later. So, the crypto scams are quite big, and pig butchering is kind of what they call that, where they really kind of butter you up and get you to trust them. And then they basically just take all the money and run. There's a few other kinds, gift card scams. Everybody's kind of probably seen or heard cases where, your boss asks you to go buy gift cards, or you might get a call from Revenue Canada or somebody that they say you owe them money and you have to go to Shoppers Drug Mart or Canadian Tire and buy a gift card, $500 or $1,000 worth of gift cards, and scrape off the numbers and give them to them. Well, that's really not a legitimate way to pay your taxes or things like that. So it should be a red flag, but a lot of people are actually falling for these things.
So what security measures are used to protect? So like specifically talking about like large accounts, what security measures are used to protect those accounts?
Yeah, I mean, in the investment world, interestingly, we haven't really seen a lot of stories about ransomware or major breaches on investment organizations. There are some, but there are maybe more that are targeting the smaller financial advisors and groups like that. So what really needs to happen, though, is that the more trusted organizations will provide security measures for their advisors to access the systems and for their clients to access the systems. And the number one way to make sure that the right people are getting in is what we call multi-factor authentication. And you've seen it before, where you've got your SMS code that gets texted to you after you enter your password, or you might be asked to use an authentication code from an app on your phone. What that does is it makes it harder for an attacker who may have stolen your password to access your account from anywhere in the world, China or wherever. And so if you take that extra time to go through and get the code and type it in, then that tells the organization that you actually have possession of that device that they sent the code to. And so that really is a much better way to protect, the authentication of your systems online. And so those are the main things, aside from other policies and procedures that are put strictly in place within the investment organization and the financial planners' offices to make sure that nothing is released without, proper authorization. But on the individual side, they should also be teaching their advisors and their clients some of the basics of how to protect information generally online. That includes things like focusing on the sender information. So if you're getting an email and you don't know exactly who it's from, or maybe it even looks like it's from somebody you know and trust, you can safely click on the sender name in any email, and that will tell you the email address that it came from. And 9 out of 10 times, if it's not legitimate, you will be able to tell right away. And that's the easiest way. I tell people, always click on the sender name, check the email address, regardless of whether you trust the person or not, because it's very easy to spot something that is suspicious, even though the message may be very convincing. So number one is, focus on the sender. Number two is check the links in your messages. It's getting harder to really tell whether a URL in a message that may be trying to get you to go somewhere is legitimate or not, because so many people use systems that, send email for them or that track their clicks and things like that. So checking the URLs can be helpful, but it's not always a reliable thing So those are a couple of the things. And then I would just say generally the context. Make sure that if somebody's asking you to do something, that it makes sense and that it's not just sort of a plausible thing. You should also think about what's the worst that could happen if this is not a legitimate request. One of the biggest things that we've seen recently is things like fraud on real estate transactions. So when somebody is about to make, their final payment for a house on the closing day, the lawyer will send them information. Here's where you should wire the money. Well, sometimes people will get a message that looks like it's from their lawyer, but it's not. And they're wiring money to the wrong person. And it's hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. And so those are things that we can actually really help people to learn how to spot and be more confident in their working online.
There's a lot of good stuff there. And maybe we could bring the focus back a little bit to like our audience working with or thinking about working with a financial advisor.
Yeah.
What are some questions that people should ask their financial advisors to make sure they have good security measures in place?
Yeah, for sure. So number one is, are they using multi-factor authentication for all of their email or their login access within their systems, right? So most of the times when you go to an investment company's portal, there will be a login for advisors and a login for clients. And either one of them, whenever they log in, they should be getting some kind of multi-factor authentication to make sure that somebody can't just log in with a stolen password, for example. And then to make sure that when you're actually getting messages from people, you should actually, the organization should have a way of publicly telling people, look, we will never ask you for your password. We will, here is the format that we will always send you information in, and here's how to contact us if you have any questions or suspicions. You should always look for and the companies should always have a place where people can get security information to say, if I'm not sure about somebody who's called me or emailed me, how can I get more information to make sure it's a legitimate request? Most of the time, if you're getting a system generated message, it looks like it's coming from a system, rather than clicking on the link in that message, go to your account, go to the online portal, log in as you normally would. And if there is a notification that you need to see, it would be in the portal, not necessarily just in the email coming to you.
Okay, awesome. Is there anything else so we talked about scams. Anything else people should know about when it comes to cybersecurity or just making good choices? I mean, you touched on a lot of things. I just want to make sure, no stone left uncovered.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge area. And that's one thing that I do a lot of is I help teams, tailor their security measures to their business. And so it may be that you need different things than what I'm saying generically here. But one of the things that I think is helpful is to have the mindset to say, all I need to really do is slow down and look more carefully at things in the context of our business. So we're tempted to, as I said before, react very quickly to things that we get. And I like to think of security, think of it this way, as the brakes on a car, just as an analogy. Imagine you had a brand new Ferrari sitting in your driveway, right? And you wanted to get to the other side of town as quickly as possible, but the Ferrari had no brakes. So how quickly could you get across town in that Ferrari without brakes compared to going in your Volkswagen or your Honda? The brakes really help you avoid danger. And so when you slow down in your business to check everything to make sure that you're getting things from the right people and that it's legitimate and it's authorized and it's a safe website, then you will actually have a lot more productivity. You will be protecting your information a lot better than if you're trying to do too much too quickly.
Okay, I think kind of what you're talking about. Maybe if there's more to it, you can speak to it. But I think you're talking a little bit about between the trade-offs of convenience and security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you think about it, you could be totally secure by taking all your money and putting it in a locked vault in a cave with armed guards and a timed access vault, but it's not that convenient. So every time you add convenience to a process for doing something, then you're making it a little bit easier for the bad guys too. And so it may not be the exact way that you would imagine, but they will always be finding, if you add some convenience, what can they do differently to actually access your information or your assets? And so you really kind of need to look at every time an organization says, hey, we've added this new convenience feature. Think about whether you want to enable that for your own convenience, or if you'd prefer it to be more secure. You may know people who are, deathly afraid of going online or using Facebook or anything, or trusting online banking, right? Many of us trust online banking and e-commerce, but we don't actually realize that some people are not comfortable with that. And if they're not comfortable with it, then it's perfectly fine for them to use a more secure method if they prefer. I've got an uncle that is in retirement, and he's really very cautious about anything online, and that's fine. So it makes a lot of sense. He can just go to the branch and do his transactions there. That's fine for him. But anytime you want to take advantage of the features that are provided by the investment company or your financial advisor, just make sure you realize what that trade-off involves and the risks that may be coming from it. And you should also make sure that your advisors are well versed in cybersecurity, the risks that may be applicable to your type of investment. And so things like crypto, it's a brand new sort of world. NFTs, non-fungible tokens. You might hear of those things, and it might sound like a great investment opportunity, but you really, as with any other investment, you need to look at what are the risks there. And in this day and age, the digital risks almost sort of cross over with the financial risks, right? Because you have the potential for not only being scammed by some crypto marketplace or something like that, but there's the actual potential for you to be targeted by an attacker, and to bypass your use of the facilities. So, for example, in crypto, there are what are called soft wallets and hard wallets. If you're familiar with that term, soft wallets mean it's kind of like online banking. Your stuff is stored somewhere online. And it should be hopefully secured properly. But if you're really extra cautious about it, you would use what's called a hard wallet, and that's almost like a USB drive, where it actually holds your credentials for logging in a piece of hardware, so it won't actually be accessible if you're not online at all. And so things like that need to be taken into account depending on what type of investments you have and what the business model of your advisor organization or your investment organization is.
Yeah, no, that's all great stuff. I know it's obviously it's such a big thing nowadays. Thankfully, one of the things our firm has done, like our broker dealer, was we have mandatory cybersecurity training,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have for like our specific firm, like in here, our team. I mean, we use a third party to make sure we have all the proper software, all that kind of stuff. But then to your point, is that's not necessarily enough. You need to have proper procedures and things like double authentication and double factor. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, multi-factor authentication.
Multi-factor. Yeah,
Yes,
thanks.
yeah.
And yeah, just good policies around how to check if emails are legitimate, all that kind of stuff.
Yep. And of course, when it comes to your clients, the end users, making sure that your passwords and your employees at the firm as well, passwords, you have policies around how many characters, for example. The fact that attackers can now sort of steal an encrypted password file sometimes from different sites. There's no such thing as zero risk, first of all, in terms of anything connected to the internet. And so there have to be these, very strong password vaults that are highly encrypted, so that if they ever get stolen, it should take a long, long time, beyond our lifetimes, for anybody to crack it or be able to break into it. And the same goes with your passwords. So if you have used, a weak password, maybe 8 characters with your dog's name and stuff like that, that becomes really easy for an attacker to try and break just by guessing. And so we typically now recommend 12 characters or more. And we like the idea of what we call passphrases, which just means it's something that you can remember more easily because it's a sentence or a phrase that but it actually makes it much stronger the longer it is. even if it might have a word that's guessable in it, you shouldn't. But basically, if it did have something that an attacker could guess, the longer that password is, exponentially more difficult. It makes it exponentially more difficult to actually log in with that account.
That's great. Now, what do you think about kind of on this whole idea of passwords? Obviously, nowadays we have dozens, if not hundreds, of online accounts,
Yes.
which no one can remember. Well, I don't know. Unless you have the same password for everything, you probably can't remember it all. And that's probably not a good strategy. So, what do you think about password managers?
Absolutely, they're the best thing for people who have more than one account. I mean, some people can remember, half a dozen or a dozen different passwords in their head, or maybe you can remember more by having a little formula for how you come up with your password for different sites. But you have to remember that anything that makes it easier for you also makes it easier for the attacker. So a password vault or a password manager is really the best compromise, because that lets you protect many passwords. I have about 300 sets of passwords myself, and I can't possibly remember them all. So I use a password vault. I use Bitwarden. It's free for personal use, and there are others like Dashlane and LastPass and others. But it really makes a lot of sense to protect your passwords with a very strong long password that protects your vault. And it also uses multi-factor authentication. So you've got good protection on your vault. But then once you've unlocked it, it basically will pre-fill, your user ID and password in any website that you go to, for example, and it makes it much more secure, but also not as inconvenient, right? And so
Yeah.
I would say password vaults are very helpful in that sense. And you mentioned reusing passwords. Password reuse is the most common way that an attacker will break into your accounts. If they have, here's a tool that I'll give you guys that you can try for yourself. It's called haveibeenpwned.com. I don't know if you've seen this before, but
Okay.
it's spelled like have I been owned, except with a P instead of the O. And haveibeenpwned.com. If you did a search on it, you'll find it. It's a guy named Troy Hunt in Australia that created this. And basically what it does is it will ask you to type in your email address that you use to log into different things. So your email address is not secret, but based on that, he can identify any publicized security breaches that your email has been involved in. So, there were breaches of LinkedIn, breaches of Adobe, and various other sites. And it will tell you which breach that email was associated with and what date it was. And so when you go there and you type in your email address, you may see a breach that occurred because of your email or your email address was associated with it. And that means that the breach means that the email and the password vault was stolen. And once the attacker has the password vault in their own possession, they can spend as much time as they want trying to crack it. And so that's why it's really important to have that long, strong password. But when you realize that that password is now out there, if you have reused that password on any other sites, now your other sites are vulnerable, and the attackers will use what's called credential stuffing. They will go to other sites. They may go to your Gmail account. They may go to your banking accounts and try to log in with the same email and password. So it's a good little exercise to check and see if the sites that you've used certain emails on have been breached. And if you're using the same password, it's a good wake-up call to say, hey, I shouldn't be using the same password everywhere, because if one of them gets stolen, it may be used somewhere else.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. Probably a good place to end it. I think we've got a lot of information out there that our audience can definitely benefit from. So I appreciate your time today, Scott. And before I let you go, can you just let people know where they can find you, how you can help? And yeah, just so they know how to get in touch.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. I speak at many professional development events like advocates, chapters, and conferences, and other corporate events as well. My website is scottnwright.com, N as in November. I also have a LinkedIn account. You can always connect with me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of tips, and I have a newsletter on LinkedIn as well. It's linkedin.com/in/Scott Wright. And you can email me at scott@scottnwright.com. And for online training. As I mentioned, I also happen to be a CEO of a company called ClickArmor, which is a gamified online training platform to help businesses get their teams to work more securely. So we've got a special deal for small businesses. So if you want to reach out to me for any of that information, happy to share it.
Perfect. Thanks for your time today, Scott.
Thanks, Joseph. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this latest episode of Your Retirement Planning Simplified. Be sure to tune back in for the next episode. And until then, we're here to help you simplify and succeed in your retirement planning.